I've been working on expanding my opening repertoire a little bit, and so I've been trying to learn the Catalan opening. And the Catalan is kind of a neat opening. You can sort of start playing it without too much prep. It's not really a system opening like the London, but it does have some mostly consistent ideas. And once you get kind of the main sense for these ideas, you can sort of just start playing it and pick up some of the nuances as you go. So in this video, I want to share a bit of what I've learned. I want to give you sort of an overview of the Catalan and some of these kind of main ideas that come up over and over. And then I'll show you a few games which I think demonstrate pretty well how the Catalan looks in real life. So let's dive in. First, I'm going to show you sort of some of the main ideas. So the Catalan, it's a D4 opening, and it's a little bit like a Queen's Gambit declined, but with a fianchettoed light squared bishop. That's kind of the main defining feature sort of the Catalan. And from here, the Catalan can take a few different directions. One of the main ones is called the closed Catalan, and that's when basically black does not capture this pawn. And the idea here is that black wants to keep this light squared bishop kind of closed out. One of the big strengths of the Catalan is that this light squared bishop can become monstrous. It can give a whole lot of pressure down this diagonal. And so black might want to just kind of try to keep things closed. And that's a perfectly valid way to play. And as white, kind of the main idea, generally speaking, is to try to eventually open things up. So after bringing out the knight and castling and so on, a nice idea to try for is something like knight b to d2 or queen c7, both of which are reinforcing this e4 square and playing for an e4 push, which can help to kind of start to break things up and make this bishop more powerful. So that might look, something like, let's see. I guess for the closed Catalan, I just mentioned the ideas. I didn't actually put a line in. The other thing you can do in the closed Catalan, like one issue sometimes with the Catalan in general is this dark squared bishop can be a bit of a problem, especially if if you get the e4 push, great, but maybe it turns out that you push e3 instead and kind of solidify this pawn chain. Now you have a whole lot of pawns on dark squares and this bishop might not be so good. So often it's good to either develop the bishop, out here to f4 or g5, maybe even trade it off for something, or push b3 here and do a double fianchetto. That can also be a good strategy with the dark squared bishop. So that's the closed Catalan, and c6 doesn't necessarily have to happen for it to be considered the closed Catalan. It basically just means that this pawn isn't being captured, but often playing for this e4 push seems to be a good kind of general idea to push for. Another move here that is common, and again, maybe not in this specific line, but another common idea that black might play for is a c5 push. And I've seen this in my games quite a bit. And in this kind of scenario, when you already have the D and C pawns pushed and then black is doing this, it's starting to look a lot like a line of the Queen's Gambit declined called the Tarash Defense. And often it can actually transpose into the Tarash. And so I found learning the Catalan means I need to do a little bit of work to learn how to play against the Tarash, actually. And the kind of, again, very general sweeping main idea, often in the Tarash, depending on the lines, but often, is to actually cause a isolated queen's pawn position and then play against that. So like we go here and then maybe we, after some developing moves, we end up taking this c pawn, and after a recapture, we get an isolated queen's pawn, or black has an isolated queen's pawn. And I actually made a video about how to play against an isolated queen's pawn position, and so you can check that out after this one. I'll link to it later. But in general, this is something that you will need to know if you are going to play the Catalan. The other very common thing that happens here, and I find this to be maybe the most common thing that I run into, is black just takes this pawn, either immediately or a little bit later, and this is known as the open Catalan. And so black gets up a pawn, and we can't recapture that pawn right away, but the benefit is this bishop is opened up immediately. And there are some pretty kind of sharp ideas here, because for one, if black tries to hold on to this pawn, then it often causes problems. So black can't try to hold onto this pawn right away, right? I guess I need to make a move. Yeah. So if for example white does this and black tries to hold onto this pawn right away, that just straight up hangs the rook. So they can't do that right away. They can maybe try to prepare with something like c6 with b5 to come. But we can undermine that right away with a4. And the thing is, if they try to, push b5 immediately, we can just take, because they actually cannot take with the c pawn, because once again, that hangs the rook. And okay, so what if they try with the a pawn instead? It's actually no better, because after b5, once again, we can take, because now they're going to lose the rook another way, especially if it's done this early in the game. This kind of thing could work maybe if like the knight and the bishop were already developed. So, there's ideas that work sometimes and not other times. But in general, it can be difficult for black to hold on to this pawn. And so what we try to do as white, typically, in the open Catalan, first of all, exert any pressure we can with this bishop. And then, put the knight here, put the queen on c7, like start to put some pressure on this pawn. And the interesting thing is, those moves, knight bd7 and queen c7, are both moves that we also talked about in the closed Catalan for trying to push this e-pawn to e4. And so some of these ideas can be kind of reused in different scenarios for slightly different purposes, which is kind of interesting. The other thing that we could do here, actually, and this is totally valid and sound, is we can actually just play queen a4 check and win this pawn back immediately after the check is blocked. And so if you don't want to kind of play down a pawn a little bit and sort of take on that risk of almost playing in a gambit-like style where you're going to win it back maybe a little bit later or have some kind of positional compensation for that pawn, then as long as the capture happens this early in the game and the king is still in the center and c6 hasn't been played and all that, you might be able to play queen a4 check and win the pawn back immediately. All right, so let me show you just a couple of games that I played to kind of practice the Catalan. So this is a club game. This was an early one, actually. I actually, lately, I haven't been playing so much in a Queen's Gambit style. I'll instead get some things developed over on this side of the board before playing c4, because I'm not necessarily prepared for Queen's Gambit accepted. But it's fine. You can transpose to the Catalan in a number of different ways. But in this game, we did it like this, and we run into an open Catalan, which is great. Queen c2. I just realized I've been saying knight bd7 and queen c7 this whole time. I mean knight bd2 and queen c2. Sorry about that. Used to doing that sort of thing as black, obviously. But anyway, queen c2. And then bishop b4. And as I mentioned, the dark squared bishop is often a bit of a problem in the Catalan. I don't know about often, but it can be a bit of a problem in the Catalan. And so in this game, I was perfectly happy to trade it off, especially since it puts my knight on the d2 square, which is kind of where I want it. Castles, knight f3, knight bd7. I get my pawn back, and then I put the knight on e5. And this is where I'm going to stop here, because this is just kind of a pretty pleasant looking position, right? I don't have my dark squared bishop, so the pawn can go to e3 at some point. I'm already putting some pressure on the c pawn. I can maybe move my rook to c1 and grab that semi-open file. And if c6 gets pushed, which is actually what happened during the game, I could, potentially start pushing these pawns on this side of the board to kind of break things up over here. And again, try to sort of exert some pressure with this light squared bishop. Of course, I should also castle pretty early on, but this is also quite a nice outpost for the knight. It's going to be a little bit hard to kick. I mean, not too bad. It can be kicked, but it's a pretty nice position. I mean, if black tries to go back here and trade it, then I can just put another knight there, right? So it gives me kind of this nice positional advantage, I think, going into the middle game. So the next game, this one was actually a blitz game, and so it got a little bit chaotic, but I played the Catalan, and a little bit of a different move order, but we get to essentially the same position. And let's see. Now, this is actually a pretty interesting idea that I learned. If this bishop comes out, one of the ideas is to try to put this bishop on c6 and try to fight for this diagonal. And so something you can often do to counter that is put the knight on e5 immediately. And so we are attacking the bishop, and we're preventing the bishop from coming to the c6 square, because if it goes there, we're just going to trade it off. And so that's kind of an interesting idea to keep in mind. Open Catalan, fianchetto, knight c6. I get rid of that bishop because, knight c6 is threatening to trade off that knight, and then I can't do anything about that bishop anymore, so I trade it off right away. E3, maybe not amazing because my bishop isn't out yet, but I figure, you know, maybe I can do the fianchetto at some point. Castle C6, and yes, so this is where C6 appears to be trying to prepare B5, but that's totally fine because I can undermine it. And then I guess after a couple of quick moves, they play B5 anyway. And this was a big mistake because I capture. And then, of course, it's a blitz game. These things happen. They, you know, grab the pawn without thinking, and I get the rook. And so the fianchettoed light squared bishop has really paid off because this is the kind of thing that you want to see in the Catalan. Things being completely opened up along this diagonal and being able to really take advantage of that very powerful bishop against the queen side. A couple more games here, just quick. So this one was interesting because it transposed into kind of a Tarash-like game pretty quickly. And this is where knowing a little bit more theory can help, because I made a pretty big mistake. Not a huge mistake, but I made a mistake here. Knowing that it's a Tarash, I felt like I wanted to trade off here and then eventually to trade here and make the isolated queen's pawn, as I mentioned. But my opponent, this was a club game, and my opponent actually captured here instead. And this is fine. White can handle this. And one of the ways to handle this is actually to move the queen over here with a check. And the reason that's interesting is because after blocking the check, I can grab here and it blocks off this queen from being able to do anything like being able to capture the pawn or put pressure on the pawn. But I decided just to capture right away, and I captured with the knight. It would have actually been better to capture with the queen. And the reason is now black can capture with the queen and my rook is hanging and I can't even put this bishop in the way. There were a few different ways to handle this, but what I decided to do was move my knight back to block. But of course that allows black to trade queens, and now I can't castle anymore. So some of these little tricks you do kind of have to pick up along the way, or do some study in the database or with the engine, and learn some of these maybe slightly trickier lines. But in the end, this wasn't a deal breaker. We went on with this game, and I managed to win the end game mainly because, time trouble and my opponent flagged eventually and so on. But it was a pretty interesting game, but a good demonstration of how, some of these lines, especially getting into something like the Tarash, you might need to have a little bit more knowledge. And last one, this game was a rapid game on chess.com. Again, slightly different move order. You can see me now taking longer to push this C4 push because this is a more recent game. So finally I push it here. And now we go into a closed Catalan, but this is something that I hadn't actually experienced before, bringing the knight out to C6. And I figured probably this is just, same ideas as before, right? And that's almost true. The problem is this knight puts a bit of pressure on the d4 pawn, meaning that after this pawn moves out of the way, the queen is also going to put pressure there. And so what I did is just one of my typical ideas for the closed Catalan, and put my queen here on c2 because it's, supporting an e4 push eventually. But that was actually the wrong idea. I could have played this knight instead, which would be a good move. And another good move would be just to simply do the fianchetto here, the double fianchetto with the dark squared bishop. But after moving the queen, after a couple more moves, I did end up moving this knight here, but then this capture happens, I take back with the knight, and now they've won a pawn at this point. And so I lost that pawn. I think I went on to win this game anyway. Yes, I did. But I definitely misplayed the opening. And so as with any opening, you do have to be a little bit careful about the ideas that you know and whether those ideas actually work in certain scenarios. Like I never would have guessed, well, I didn't guess, I didn't realize during the game that this knight c6 move at this point means that although this idea works and this idea works, this idea doesn't work, right? So some of these things you learn with experience, some of them you might be able to figure out over the board, but for the most part, a lot of the ideas are pretty consistent, and that's one thing that I like. It's kind of easy to start experimenting with this opening, and maybe experimenting in less serious games or something first, and start to figure out some of the positions that you're going to end up getting into. And so it's been kind of fun learning the Catalan. It's, as I said, it's an interesting opening. It's one that is pretty easy to get started with. And then as you experiment, you can start to figure out specific lines that you need to learn and specific ideas that work in some cases and not in others. But a lot of the ideas tend to work somewhat in a lot of the variations that you'll run into. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it inspires you to give the Catalan a try in some of your next games. If so, definitely leave a comment and let me know how it goes. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.